All right, folks. Well, welcome to Arlington's War, the capture of Alexandria County, a special online program put on by the Arlington County Department of Parks and Recreation, Conservation and Interpretation Unit. My name is John McNair. I'm the park historian at Fort C.F. Smith Park. So I'm responsible for a lot of the public outreach programs that Fort C.F. Smith Park is able to provide to the Arlington County community. Now, like a lot of you, we got pretty nervous when the COVID-19 pandemic kind of forced us to change a lot of our programming plans. So I was so happy when I realized this could give us a chance to do something a little different with our programs, maybe reach out a little bit further to a much larger audience. And so far, I have not been disappointed. Thank you guys so much for registering. Thank you so much for agreeing to spend part of your Saturday night with us. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you find it entertaining, and I hope you learned something that maybe you didn't quite know when you came into our little program.
So quiet.
Now, a couple things before we get started. First off, we are recording this program, so if you have just logged on, please make sure that your microphone is muted. If I see any unmuted mics, I'll try to mute them as best as I can, but just please be mindful that those stay muted the whole time. If you have any questions for me, we will reserve some time for questions at the end. My associate Maddie from Gulf Branch Nature Center is here with us as well. She's going to be monitoring the chat box and feeding your questions to me as they come up at the end of the program. So with all that in mind, let's say we begin. Now, if you read the description of this program, you probably noticed that I hyped this up as an anniversary program. Today marks the 159th anniversary of a pretty important moment in Arlington County's history. Today marks the anniversary of the formal secession vote from the state of Virginia. Meaning, on May 23rd, 1861, the people of Virginia held their formal vote on whether or not to ratify the recently approved Ordinance of Secession. Now, if that's throwing you for a loop right now, it's understandable. First off, some of you may be thinking to yourselves, that wasn't in the description. Your description was about the 159th anniversary of the Union capture of Alexandria County. And you are correct. Those dates coincide with one another. Only about 12 hours are going to separate Virginia's formal secession vote from the capture of Alexandria County. So when you talk about one event, you have to talk about both. Today, we are going to look back at the steps that led to secession, specifically in Arlington County, or as it was then known, Alexandria County. We're going to see how secession directly affected the people of Arlington County's past and how that all-important secession vote would have long-standing repercussions in the county that we now live in. All right, hopefully you guys are seeing the next slide in my PowerPoint. Maddie, thumbs up if that came through. Perfect. On a roll today. Now, before we can jump too far into the nuts and bolts of the Civil War in our county, we have to go back a few years. We need to establish a little bit of a groundwork for the history of Alexandria County so that you can really appreciate what's facing Alexandria County residents. Now, if you look on the left-hand side of the PowerPoint, you are going to see a zoomed-in section of an old 1860s map. This is a map of the District of Columbia as it stood at the early days of the Civil War. Now, anyone from the area who's familiar with Washington, D.C., familiar with their sports team, familiar with their branding, at this point you should be aware of what the District of Columbia actually looks like. It's that odd half-diamond shape pressed right up against the Potomac River. I always need to emphasize this, particularly if I have children in my programs. But Arlington County is actually the other part of that diamond.
Hey, John, I'm going to interrupt you for just 1 second.
Yes.
Some folks are saying that they didn't see the slide advance. if you could maybe just describe the slide we're on so that everyone can figure out if they're on the right slide or not.
Of course.
Great. I think maybe it's some folks who joined right now, but I'm not sure.
Gotcha. All right. So right now we should be looking at a slide with a top title that says A Tale of Two Counties. On the left-hand side, you should be seeing an old map of the District of Columbia with Alexandria County on the other side of the Potomac. To the right, you should be seeing some text describing a little bit about what we are going to experience at this moment in time in District of Columbia history. So we will...
Okay, so we've got some folks who are seeing that slide. I think maybe computers just needed a second to catch up or something, but
yep,
it looks like, yeah, it looks like we're getting there. So
okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. If any other issues like that pop up again, just let us know and I can try and slow down a little bit. Again, this is a relatively new platform for us as well, so we are happy to help. But anyway, yes, so the story of Alexandria County really is the story of two counties. In 1791, when the boundary markers are first laid to map out the 100 square miles that become the District of Columbia, ground is chosen on both the Maryland side of the Potomac and the Virginia side of the Potomac. Now, on the Virginia side of the Potomac, there is already a town in what becomes the southernmost corner of the district. That is the town of Alexandria. The other section of the Virginia district extending northwestwards along the Potomac, that is going to become Alexandria County, or as it's sometimes referred to, the country portion or the county portion of Alexandria. So as early as 1791, you are going to start to have two very different mindsets among people who come to settle in Alexandria County. Some of them are going to be native-born Virginians, people who have either been lumped into the district as the result of this new mapping, or in some cases, they are going to be people coming southward to live and work in the new district and who don't necessarily have that connection to the state of Virginia. This is going to make itself known at a couple different points in history, when the residents of Alexandria County and the residents of Alexandria City aren't always going to see eye to eye. Now, we have two votes in particular that are really going to highlight this growing difference between the Virginia sect and the District of Columbia sect. The first instance is going to pop up with this question of retrocession. Pretty much from the moment that Washington, D.C. is established, you have a group of people who are not happy with the new lumping in of Alexandria into the district. They do not like that they no longer have access to their representatives. They no longer have access to the Virginia state government and that benefits, and they would like their section of the district returned back to the Commonwealth. But again, you also have a growing number of farmers and government workers who have joint businesses in the district, joint properties in the district, or work for the federal government. The majority of those people are going to reside out in Alexandria County. When it comes time to vote on the formal issue of retrocession, about 15, 20 years before the start of the Civil War, you are going to have Alexandria City vote overwhelmingly for retrocession, and you are going to have Alexandria County vote against retrocession. Now, unfortunately, because these two places are connected, the two voting places get lumped together. And as Alexandria City has the numbers, pretty much any way that they vote, Alexandria County will be drawn in with it. Now, this split is going to narrow a little bit some years later with the election of 1860. In November of 1860, 4 men run for president. Now, one of those candidates is not very popular, anywhere in the southern part of the United States. That is, of course, Abraham Lincoln, who is running on a platform in which he is advocating, among other things, a limitation of slavery. Now, the dislike for Abraham Lincoln is not as strong in Alexandria County as it is in other parts of Virginia. To put that into perspective a little bit, you have certain polling places in Fairfax and Loudoun County where Lincoln doesn't even appear on the ballot. In Alexandria County, not only does Lincoln appear on the ballot, but he doesn't come in last place. Lincoln supposedly is going to finish 3rd out of 4th in Alexandria County, gaining a whopping 11 votes from Alexandria County voters. Now, needless to say, that is not going to be enough to deliver the county to Abraham Lincoln. Alexandria County is still going to vote for the constitutional unionist candidate, John Bell. But it does show that there is a stronger connection to that growing federal ideology that you're not necessarily going to see in Alexandria City, where more people are advocating for Virginia. What is good for Virginia? What is good for the agrarian slave powers that run the state? Okay. Now, our next slide, we should be looking at a rather odd map of the greater DC area, Alexandria to Washington to Baltimore. Again, we'll give that a second to see if that loads up for everybody. Now, this map might be a little strange at first, but it really is one of my favorites of the era because it really shows exactly the problem with Alexandria County as well as the benefit of it. If you look right at the bottom of this map, you are going to see on the right-hand side, Washington, D.C., that big city surrounded by water. If you start to take your gaze to the left-hand side, you're going to see just 2 bridges, the narrowest of which is really only covering no more than half a mile of Potomac River water. That bridge leads right up to Arlington House. So Alexandria County, at its narrowest point, is really just about half a mile away from Washington, D.C. On top of that, Alexandria County has an elevation advantage. If anyone here has ever been to Arlington National Cemetery, you can get a fantastic view of the DC skyline just by hiking up to the Arlington House. Now, at the time of the outbreak of the Civil War, cannons have made some significant advances. Cannons can now hit targets 2 to 3, in some cases even 4 miles away. So as the country starts to move more and more towards secession, as southern states start to loudly proclaim that they want to sever their bonds and even declare war with the government of the United States, you're suddenly going to have elements in Washington, D.C. who are worried. Because should Virginia follow that route, Washington is going to be in the literal crosshairs of the Confederate artillery. All right. Now for our next slide, we've zoomed in on that map a little bit. It's washed out a little, and we have a very basic timeline on the right-hand side. On April 17th, 1861, the convention in Richmond, Virginia, is going to approve a formal ordinance of secession. This is a document that would declare Virginia's intentions to leave the United States and join the Confederate States of America, which at that point is now at war with the Union. Now, traditionally, many historians have viewed April 17th as the date of Virginia's secession. That's not 100% true. Remember, on the 17th, All that has happened is that a declaration of secession has been approved. That declaration needs to be ratified in a referendum vote by the people. Now, that vote is put off until May 23rd, 1861. So you have about a month, give or take, where the entirety of Virginia, and in particular Alexandria County, is in a very strange position. Have we seceded? Have we remained in the Union? And if one or the other is true, what are we going to do about it? Things from that point on are going to move very, very quickly on both the Union and the Confederate side of things. Now, to start off, almost as soon as that Virginia Ordinance of Secession is passed in Richmond, you're going to start to see a large number of resignations from the various government offices and military branches based out of Washington. The most notable person to partake of all this will be then Colonel Robert E. Lee of the U.S. Army. Robert E. Lee lives in his wife's home of Arlington. The Arlington house is his. Now, Robert E. Lee is not the only Alexandria County resident to resign his commission with the United States government as soon as the secession train starts to roll out of town. A few months prior to the ordinance, William Nutt, a farm owner in the vicinity of East Falls Church, is going to resign from the U.S. Treasury Department. A U.S. Naval lieutenant named Bushrod Hunter is also going to resign from the U.S. Navy about a day after Robert E. Lee resigns from the Army. The Hunters own another major plantation in our county, the plantation of Abingdon, the approximate location of the Reagan Airport. Now, with these resignations are going to come even more movements out of the county. As people start to realize that the war is coming, and more particularly, as they realize that the war is coming to this specific spot because of the importance of Washington, D.C., they realize that Arlington is going to be the front lines, at least for a moment. So some people, like the Lee Custis family, are going to leave the county. In early May of 1861, the Custises will hand the keys to their house to Selina Norris Gray, the enslaved housekeeper who works on the property. So Mrs. Gray is going to be responsible not only with the safeguarding of Arlington House, but also the treasures that it contains. Specifically, she is going to be left to guard the Custises family's large collection of artifacts belonging once to George Washington. Now, other county residents who hold residencies in the District of Columbia are going to quickly go north of the Potomac River. Still, others are going to remain in their properties and try and wait out the possible storm. After all, nothing has happened yet. They still have a chance to vote on this referendum. But any hope that that vote is going to be fair and balanced is quickly going to get crushed as well. For one thing, in this buildup to the secession vote, Alexandria is going to see the formation of a homegrown Confederate battalion known as the Alexandria Battalion. This is made up of Confederate companies from many of the local Northern Virginia counties, places like Prince William and Fairfax, and in particularly Alexandria and Arlington County. These soldiers are going to make up an Alexandria Defense Force for the Confederacy. Part of what they are going to do is they are going to occupy the major centers of the county. They are going to occupy the courthouse, they are going to occupy the polling places, and in some cases, they are even going to begin confiscating crops and horses from some of the local farms. Now, this troop buildup is not just happening in Alexandria. You also have troops building up on the DC side of the Potomac as well. Almost as soon as the Confederates in South Carolina fire on Fort Sumter and formally begin the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln is going to call for volunteers from all loyal states to head towards DC. So, in the weeks following Virginia's Ordinance of Secession vote, you are going to have volunteer regiments from places like New York and New Jersey and Massachusetts and Michigan all flooding into DC. To make matters worse for the Virginians, Abraham Lincoln is also going to extend his naval blockade of the Confederacy to include the state of Virginia. Now, not to be outdone, the Confederate government during this time is also going to have a vote of their own, and they are going to declare that Richmond, Virginia is the new capital of the Confederacy. Finally, a large Confederate force under PGT Beauregard is slowly going to start massing itself just 30 miles away at Manassas Junction. So if you are an Alexandria County resident, here's your problem. Whether you support the Union or whether you support the secession movement, you know that Alexandria County is caught between a rock and a hard place. You are between two armies. One army is just a few miles outside of your town and has control over all your government buildings. Another army is besieging you just north of the Potomac River and has a naval blockade waiting just outside the state. You are stuck. So, what can we do? Well, the first thing we can do is we can keep an eye out for the types of soldiers that are going to start coming into our county. The nice thing about this era is we have lots of early Union War photographs of regiments that came into Washington, D.C. Now, this first photograph that I've popped up is a photograph of the 7th New York State Militia. This is one of those early regiments to arrive in Washington, D.C. Now, the New York militia is going to play a big part in the movement that is about to come. This regiment in particular was relatively famous. They had a history that dated back all the way to 1807. When they arrive, they come complete with their own band, their own engineer company, and their own pre-war cannons. Our next featured regiment is a little newer than the 7th New York State Militia, but still, they have a pre-war legacy as well. The 69th New York State Militia, pictured here outside of a chaplain's tent, is going to form a couple times in New York's history, this particular iteration dating back to 1851. Now, the 69th New York State Militia was formed primarily by Irish Americans living in New York City. At the time of the Civil War, the 69th New York State Militia is in a bit of a pickle. A few months before the secession crisis broke out, their commanding officer, Colonel Michael Corcoran, got himself in trouble when he refused to have his regiment go on parade before the Prince of Wales, who was touring America at the time. Because of this, Michael Corcoran was facing possible court-martial charges when the American Civil War broke out. Because Lincoln needed every volunteer possible to head down to Washington, the court-martial proceedings were swept away, and the 69th New York Militia made it to Washington as well. But possibly the real stars of the Union's arrival in the district would be the men in this slide right here. The 11th New York Volunteers, also known as New York's Fire Zouaves. The Fire Zouaves were formed as a direct response to Abraham Lincoln's call for volunteers. They dressed themselves in the style of a Zouave, or a French soldier stationed in North Africa. Now, the Fire Zouaves were recruited primarily from fire stations in New York City. Their colorful uniforms, combined with the athletic public drills that they would put on, made them stars for the Union press. To top that off, they were led by a dashing young colonel named Elmer Ellsworth, who had been a friend of Abraham Lincoln prior to his rise to the presidency. Now, when May 23rd, 1861 finally arrives, when the secession vote comes, for many people, it does seem like a bit of a technicality. Again, Alexandria County is anything but free and independent at the time. The photograph on the right-hand side of this next slide, how Virginia was voted out of the Union, was a political cartoon released not too long after this vote. It was published in Harper's Weekly. Now, this depiction of a Virginia polling place is not necessarily accurate to every county in the state of Virginia, but it is reminiscent of what happens in Alexandria County. The Alexandria County polling place at Ball's Crossroads was occupied by members of the Confederate militia. And Union men who went out to vote for the Union cause were putting their life in their own hands. One prominent Unionist from Alexandria County was a militia commander by the name of William Gary. At the time of the secession vote, William Gary had been arrested by the Confederate militia and jailed in the Alexandria jailhouse. Another prominent Alexandria County secessionist named James Roach of Roach's Mills fame actually threatened other county residents at gunpoint not to vote in the election. This did not stop many people in Alexandria County from turning out and indeed voting for the Union cause. By the end of the day on May 23rd, 1861, Alexandria County by majority votes in favor of remaining in the Union. The Union sentiment is just that strong. But just like we saw in the past votes, their vote isn't going to matter quite as much because it will be combined with the votes from Alexandria City. And Alexandria City much more favors secession. So in the evening hours of May 23rd, 1861, almost 159 years ago exactly from the moment we're in right now, the writing is on the wall. Whether you support the Union or not, if you are a Virginian, you are about to leave, and you know what is waiting as soon as you have left. If you live in Alexandria County, you can see what's waiting for you just on the other side of the Potomac. Thousands of Union soldiers are in campsites in DC, waiting for orders to move out. For the last several weeks, they have been told that a movement into the heights of Arlington is imminent. All they're really waiting for is the formal secession vote. So, with that vote finalized in the late hours of May 23rd, the Union Army is now told to move. Okay. Now, the Union plan is going to consist of the three men in this newest slide. General Samuel Heintzelman of the U.S. Army and Major General Charles Sanford of the New York State Militia are going to take the lead on this one. The plan is for these two men to lead two columns across the two bridges that directly connect Washington, D.C. to the Arlington Heights. The bulk of these soldiers will be New York militiamen, like the militiamen I pointed out earlier. So Major General Charles Sanford will have overall command of the militia forces, but General Samuel Heintzelman really is the U.S. Army's man in the operation. Now, for all these weeks of preparation, Heintzelman understands that the goal of the May 23rd expedition is to retake Arlington. The heights of Arlington are what overlook Washington. The heights of Arlington are what need to be fortified and defended. But according to Heintzelman, in the afternoon of May 23rd, a new objective is added to the proposed Union plan. This new objective is the capture of Alexandria City. To lead out the expedition into Alexandria City, Colonel Elmer Ellsworth of the Fire Zouaves is going to board a steamer with his men, as well as with the 2nd Michigan Infantry, and they are going to make a Potomac River landing onto the docks of Alexandria City. So on the night of May 23rd, we are looking at a movement of somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 Union soldiers, some by land, some by sea, all intending to grab as much defensive territory in Alexandria County as they can, as quickly and as painlessly as they can. The Union soldiers start making their movements at 9 p.m. on May 24th, 1861. The sun has set, the sky is clear, the moon is out. They are told to leave their campsites without their knapsacks, without their haversacks, without their canteens, without anything that can make a noise or give them away. They then line up along the DC ends of the Long Bridge and the Aqueduct Bridge, those 2 bridges that connect Washington to Alexandria County. Now, on the other side of the Potomac River, you have a much smaller force of Confederates waiting to hold the area. You only have about 600 Confederate soldiers in the Alexandria Battalion who are really tasked with the defense of the entire city and county. They are not in a good position to defend the city. The Confederates defending Alexandria actually almost abandoned Alexandria at the very start of the month. Now, when asked why they did this, their commanding officer, in a reply back to Richmond, said quite simply that he had neither the men nor the guns to defend the city. Many of his men were armed with outdated weapons, and of those outdated weapons, many of them did not have ammunition either. So, if a fight is going to break out in Alexandria, it probably won't last very long. Now, the columns are going to move across the bridges by about 2 a.m. on May 24th. The column that crosses the Aqueduct Bridge, and which includes the 69th New York State Militia, is going to make it about as far as the Loudoun and Hampshire Railroad on the opposite end of Alexandria County. By reaching the railroad, they are actually able to stop an incoming Confederate train that was intending to arrive in Alexandria early that morning. So effectively, the New York State Militia is able to cut off train traffic into the city. Now, the column that crosses over the Long Bridge, which includes the 7th New York State Militia, is going to slowly try to make its way down south so that they can hit the north side of Alexandria. The goal is for elements of the column to reach Alexandria at the same time that Ellsworth and his expedition land in Alexandria from the steamships. Now, by and large, these movements go together without a hitch. The Union soldiers who cross the bridges encounter very little resistance and meet no casualties. A few Confederate guards and at least one Confederate sergeant who was on board the passenger train are captured during this nighttime movement. Now, Ellsworth's group is going to run into a little bit of trouble. As the steamships appear outside of Alexandria, a few Confederate guards on duty will fire at them. However, this small fire isn't going to do much to the ship. Now, seeing how outnumbered they are, the Confederate forces inside Alexandria are going to make a very hasty retreat. As the bulk of the Alexandria Battalion makes their way towards the train station to evacuate the city, a homegrown Confederate cavalry company is going to try and buy them time and engage the landing Federals. However, this cavalry company is captured in its entirety without any casualties on either side. So an additional 35 Confederate cavalrymen are captured inside Alexandria City. All told, this takes about 2.5 hours. It's 2 a.m. when the soldiers start crossing over the bridges, and it's 4:30 a.m. when the Union Army arrives in Alexandria. A 6,000-man night operation from 2 different fronts goes almost perfectly. Unfortunately, it isn't perfect enough. After the Union occupation of Alexandria, around 5 a.m. as the sun is rising, Colonel Ellsworth of the Fire Zouaves is going to enter the Marshall House, an Alexandria hotel. The Marshall House has a Confederate flag flying over top that can be seen from Washington, D.C. Ellsworth will ascend the staircase to take down the flag, and as he descends from the staircase, he is going to be shot at point-blank range by Mr. Jackson, the hotel's proprietor. Jackson will then be killed by Francis Brownell, a member of Ellsworth's regiment who was actually in that picture I showed you with the Fire Zouaves. Now, because of this very brief, very bloody encounter, the newspapers the next day aren't going to talk about a flawless movement into Alexandria County. Instead, they are going to talk about the tragedy of Colonel Ellsworth. Ellsworth will become the first Union martyr. And in this one brief instance, he is going to be involved in a mutually destructive encounter. This freak show of bloodshed in Alexandria is going to be just the start of 4 years of constant warfare in our surrounding area. Now, for the people of Alexandria County, the war doesn't end with this quick arrival of the Union Army. The Union Army still has a lot that they can do with Alexandria County. Virtually the entire length of the county's Potomac coast, up from the Chain Bridge all the way down to 4 Mile Run, will be dotted with Union Army fortifications. By the end of the war, there will be more than 20 named forts in Arlington County for the Union. On top of that, just about every crossroad and every hill within the county will have some sort of Union outpost or encampment looking out into the rest of Virginia. Other buildings will be repurposed for different Union Army uses. Colonel Robert E. Lee's home will be repurposed in part as the Arlington National Cemetery for Union dead, and in part as Freedmen's Village, a community of recently freed African Americans. Now, finally, the grounds around what we believe to be the Air Force monument will be turned into a camp of instruction for the future United States colored troops in 1863. So that's a lot to happen to a small county. Remember, today, Arlington County is the smallest self-governing county in the Commonwealth of Virginia in terms of landmass. And our county borders are roughly the same as they were during the Civil War. This one moment in late May of 1861 is going to put all eyes in the Union squarely on Arlington. Arlington cannot sit out of the war. Arlington, whether it wants to or not, has to be repurposed in its entirety for the Union war effort. And today, the remnants of that Union war effort can still be seen in our neighborhoods, in our public buildings, in our government buildings, and in our own backyards. Now that is where I'm going to leave the formal part of the presentation. Now, I glossed over a lot of things there, so I'm hoping I can answer some of your questions to maybe flesh out some of these finer points. Again, if you have any questions for me, please use the chat box. Maddie is going to leaf through a couple of them, and then probably by about 8 o'clock, we will go ahead and disengage.
Hey, John, so no one typed any questions while you were presenting. We did have a few individuals raise hands. I believe one of them has left, but Elizabeth Dearson is still here. Elizabeth, did you have a question for John? And if you could type it into the chat, that would be great. Shannon said she was still unable to see slides 11 and 12. So again, I think some people were experiencing a little bit of a delay. Other people seem to not be experiencing that delay. Shannon, I believe John is recording this presentation, and so he will be able to send everybody a recording of it once we're all done this evening. So if for whatever reason your computer doesn't catch up to where we are, you'll be able to see slides 11 and 12. Jerry wants to know how many people lived in Alexandria County on May 23rd, 1861.
Very good question. So this one is a little hard to piece together because, again, a lot of the people, or I won't say a lot, but there's a good number of people in Alexandria County who have residency in Alexandria County and again in Washington, D.C. So a lot of the farms, a lot of the homes, they might be occupied by the extended family of D.C. residents. This makes the exact living population a little hard to piece together. Let's see, I don't have that figure in front of me, but when it comes time to vote on the Ordinance of Secession, you're looking at close to about 1,000 votes cast total. Now, that's not everyone. A lot of those people would have had families. A lot of people were intimidated out of voting. And again, that does not include the enslaved population, which is also hard to determine because the enslaved population was only counted officially once a year. And during that one time a year, you could have enslaved persons rented out of the county, you could have enslaved persons rented into the county, and that's going to cause the numbers to fluctuate. For more information on historic Alexandria County, I believe we have some representatives here from the Alexandria Historical Society who, if you look into some of their research and go to their museum when things open up, they can help you out with just about anything you need to know about historic Alexandria County from any era. Good question.
So, John, it looks like we have a few more population questions, which I'm going to group together the populations of Alexandria City and Alexandria in 1861, which I think you already addressed. And then let me scroll down here, the population in the 1860 census, which sounds like a way for folks to sort of research and figure out those numbers. I'm going to move on to questions about the forts. So give me 1 second just to scroll up here.
Perfect.
Evan and Wesley want to know where the forts on 4 Mile Run were located and what present day landmarks they are near or were near.
Sure.
How many of the forts are we still able to visit? And do the forts in Arlington face away from the Potomac or do any face towards it?
Very good question. So, working back a little bit, if you go down to the 4 Mile Run area, there are 2 Arlington County public parks that mark the approximate locations of 4 Mile Run fortifications. You have Fort Barnard, which is now a fort-themed playground just a little bit north of 4 Mile Run, and you have Fort Reynolds Park, which is just a little bit south of 4 Mile Run in Fairlington. Now, at neither of these locations do you really have evidence of earthworks that have survived. Now, the exciting thing is that very recently, within the last year, the AFAC, the Arlington Food Center, they did a renovation in their basement, and they actually discovered Civil War cannonballs. So, based on the location of their building, we have come to believe that that may have been the location of an independent federal battery that would have pointed up 4 Mile Run in the direction of Falls Church. We know batteries like that were scattered down the 4 Mile Run as well. Now, to your other question, do any of the Alexandria County forts face into the Potomac River? The simple answer to that is if they do, they also face into Virginia. The forts that exclusively face into the Potomac River are usually going to be found on the Maryland side.
Okay, John, we've got a question about the role of the domestic slave trade in fostering support for the Confederacy in Alexandria City. Etienne is wondering if you can speak a little bit about that. And then also folks were wondering about the role of Theodore Roosevelt Island during the Civil War, if there was one, and if so, what it was.
Sure. And some of those can get kind of lumped together a little bit. Now, in regards to the ins and outs of the domestic slave trade in Alexandria City, unfortunately, as an Arlington County historian, that one escapes me in great detail, although the folks in the Alexandria City Historic Department do a fantastic job with those presentations as well. So there are lots of places you can keep looking. In terms of the role in Alexandria County, though, I can tell you that by the time of the Civil War, slavery in Alexandria County was, I wouldn't say it was moving away, but it had sort of plateaued. It's a phenomena that has been explored by a number of more recent historians of slavery in the region, but as more lands began to open up out west, the more established slave states like Virginia and Northern Virginia in particular, where there's not a big cash crop industry, they are going to begin moving large numbers of enslaved persons forcibly westward. So by 1860, that is still happening, but the enslaved families in Alexandria County are also now, in many cases, multiple generations of enslaved families. There are personal ties there. Selina Norris Gray is a perfect example. She was the enslaved maid at the Arlington house who was trusted with the keys to the house when the Lee and the Custis family left the area. She was a second generation Arlington estate enslaved woman. So on her side of things, she was able to maintain a fairly strong family relationship inside Alexandria County. But that was by no means the rule. All right. Now, I think we had a question about Roosevelt Island. Was that correct? Sure. So, yes, Roosevelt Island was also a campsite of sorts during the Union occupation of Alexandria County. Supposedly, this was another one of those campsites for the recently raised United States colored troops that are slowly going to start trickling into Alexandria County towards the end of the war. If you look on the greater map of Civil War Washington that we see here on the screen, you'll notice that the fort closest to Roosevelt Island is Fort Haggerty. Now, if you want to look at the records of all of these forts, a lot of them are, or a lot of their abstracts, I should say, are preserved in the National Archives. You can check out one of the books and read them in the archive space. And when you do that, you start to see patterns. Where are the most soldiers dying from disease? Where are the most soldiers deserting? This, that, and the other. At Fort Haggerty, you get to a point in the Civil War where lots of the enlisted men there are starting to apply for officers' commissions with the United States colored troops. So this follows the thinking that there probably is a larger USCT encampment on Roosevelt Island.
Thanks, John. We've got a few more questions. There are some that are sort of related to each other, so I'm going to try to group them together. Folks are wondering, in 1861, how big were the Confederate and Union armies? Were there many Union-Confederate battles fought within Arlington County proper? And did any of the forts see action? And then finally, related to that, we have Eric wondering when the first Union casualties were buried at Arlington House.
Ah, okay. So this question of fighting in Arlington County, that one really is a work in progress. Even to this day, we are still conducting research and learning more about various actions in and around the county. So at this point in time, I don't have an exact number of battles or of casualties, but the most action you're going to see in Arlington is going to happen right after the First Battle of Manassas. After the First Battle of Manassas, the Union Army is pushed from Manassas all the way back into Arlington. Meanwhile, elements of the Confederate Army will make it as far as Falls Church. They'll occupy some of those hills like Upton's Hill and Munson's Hill and Mason's Hill that all look into the county. For about 2 months, give or take, from early August to the end of September 1861, you are going to have skirmishes and movements and probing actions from both sides trying to regain footholds into the other's county. Now, once the Army leadership changes on the Union and on the Confederate side, you're going to see a very quick, disillusion of those actions. They're going to move on to bigger campaigns elsewhere. For more information on the fighting that occurs in Arlington, Peter Vasilopoulos, who may be in our program today, he's been teaching some very nice programs with the Encore Learning Center that hopefully will get picked up again once classes get normalized. So I definitely recommend looking at the Encore Learning programs because there's some good stuff coming out there as well. Now, as for the forts, none of the forts in Arlington are directly assaulted, but you do get some stories, particularly around the Chain Bridge fortifications, Fort Ethan Allen and Fort Marcy, where supposedly Confederate partisan rangers, like men under John Singleton Mosby's command or E.V. White's command, will sneak into the area, fire off their guns, and steal a few horses. On a more technical note, the artillerymen at Fort Ethan Allen are in 1861 going to make an artillery bombardment of Confederate soldiers in Falls Church using hot air balloon reconnaissance. So it is the first time in world military history where air power is used to direct ground artillery fire. Not exactly a major engagement, but it is a major point in the history of human warfare. I think we had a question about Arlington Cemetery. So the Arlington Cemetery is going to be it's going to be started in 1863. I apologize, I don't have the exact date right in front of me, but that is going to happen as a direct response to Robert E. Lee's rise within the Confederate Army. The logic is going to be that if he is going to deal this much death to the Union soldiers in Virginia, then they have to be buried at his house.
So we have a little bit of information from G.W. McLeod, who said the first burial was May 13th, 1964. I guess there used to be a plaque at the Marshall House that was removed a few years ago. Mm-hmm. There's one last question from Jennifer Myers. She wants to know if, John, you have any info about Union encampments in what is now Lacey Woods Park at the corner of Washington Boulevard and George Mason.
Ooh, that is a good one. Off the top of my head, I do not, because again, so much of our county is converted to Union campsites that, for one, there's probably going to be a campsite at just about every major intersection that you see on the county map. Now, the other problem is that campsites did not have the kind of hard mailing addresses that we would like. Some of these campsites might move a little bit. Camp Casey is a perfect example. Camp Casey is the place where we know that the United States colored troops were trained in Arlington. Well, we also know that there were multiple Camp Caseys in the district from one time to another. So at any given point, if someone says they're in Camp Casey and that Camp Casey is by the Fairfax Seminary, well, that might not be the same Camp Casey that we had a year earlier or even a year later. So it does get tricky. Now, if you have any specific research questions like that, that is part of the day-to-day job that we do here at Fort C.F. Smith. So always feel free to send those email requests to me. That is jmcnair@arlingtonva.us. Part of my job is helping the county learn about these kinds of things, and I'm always happy to look into them for you. So you've got my contact information. Feel free to use it.
All right, I don't see any more questions coming into the chat, so yeah, I think that might be it.
Perfect. Well, thank you all very much for joining us today. Again, it is so helpful when people join our online park programs that we really can't say thank you enough. It is a big help to us, and we hope it was a help to you. So once again, this was John McNair from Fort C.F. Smith Park saying thanks for coming around, and I hope to see you at the park very soon. Y'all have a great night, guys.